Hello, and welcome to this IFES Hangout, Divergent Trends E-Voting in the US and the World. My name is Rakesh Sharma, and I will be the moderator for this Hangout. IFES, or the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, is a global leader in democracy promotion and has worked in more than 135 countries around the world to support citizens' rights to participate in free and fair elections. The technical expertise provided by IFES contributes to strengthened electoral processes and an enhanced voice for citizens. As a technical leader in the field of elections, IFES works closely with electoral management bodies to address various areas of the electoral process in order to strengthen them. In the past few years, one of the issues that IFES has started to address with increasing regularity is that of electronic voting, as we see more and more countries moving towards using these technologies in their electoral systems. Our Hangout today will be focused on this issue of electronic voting, examining global trends in the use of e-voting technologies, and focusing specifically on factors that may help to explain why use of these technologies is facing challenges in the United States, while at the same time it is expanding globally. I am joined by two experts on e-voting who will provide their opinions and expertise on this issue, Ben Goldsmith and Thad Hall. Hi, Ben and Thad. How are you?
Very good.
Very good, thank you.
Okay. Ben Goldsmith is IFES's Electoral Technology Advisor and has over 10 years of experience providing managerial and technical expertise in post-conflict and developing democracies. He's an expert in election technology who has co-authored several articles and reports focused on e-voting, and especially the implementation of e-voting. Thad is an associate professor of political science at the University of Utah. He has authored more than 40 research articles, including Point, Click, and Vote, The Future of Internet Voting, and Electronic Elections, The Perils and Promise of Digital Democracy. Now, before I ask Ben and Thad to comment on our topic today, I would like to remind our audience that there are various means through which you can provide comments and questions, which hopefully Ben and Thad will be able to address before the hour is out. Now, if you're watching on Google+, we invite you to submit questions through the comments section. The only thing we would note is that in order for you to see comments as they come in, you'll need to refresh the page periodically. Other viewers on the IFES website can submit questions via email to locio@ifes.org. That's L as in Larry, O-S-I-O at ifes.org. Or you can tweet questions or comments to @IFES 1987. So, taking care of those formalities, I'll start by asking Ben to provide us sort of an overview of global trends in the use of e-voting and factors that may explain why more and more countries are moving towards e-voting.
Okay, thanks, Rakesh. I think it's important before we start talking about electronic voting in more detail to just discuss the terminology, because it can be used very inconsistently around the world by different election management body and experts. So I think it's important to define what we mean by e-voting. And I guess I would categorize e-voting into two different types of technology. One is electronic voting and one is electronic counting. And a simple definition of electronic voting would be the use of electronic means to record the choice of the voter on the ballot. And typically this would be through a voting machine in a polling station. But in some cases, a voting machine may actually produce a physical ballot, which is then placed in a ballot box and counted at a later stage, either manually or using a separate device. Internet voting is a subcategory of electronic voting, and I would consider this to be the use of the internet to record ballot choices of the voter and to transmit and store those ballot choices in a remote location. And I think I would classify this as being different from, for example, the use of the internet or email to deliver ballots either out to voters or return them back to an election management body from the voter. In terms of electronic counting, it's the use of electronic means to count physical ballots, and these would normally be paper ballots, but they don't have to be paper ballots. And I think we also see that as new technologies are arising in this field, they sort of challenge these boundaries between different technologies as well. In terms of global usage of the technologies, recent research into the use of electronic voting machines found that 31 countries around the world had used electronic voting machines or are currently using electronic voting machines for their political elections. There are 4 countries around the world which use exclusively use electronic voting machines for their elections, and they are India, Brazil, Bhutan, and Venezuela. There are 11 countries around the world which use electronic voting machines in some areas of the country to hold elections. 5 countries are still going through the pilot process for using electronic voting machines. 8 countries have piloted EVMs and decided not to continue with them. And 3 have used electronic voting machines over a period of several elections and then decided to discontinue their use. And they are Germany, the Netherlands, and Paraguay. And I think we see very different trends in different parts of the world in terms of EVM use. I think we see Asia and South America who are heavily influenced by the Indian experience of electronic voting machines and the Brazilian experience of electronic voting machines, respectively. And those countries have been very strong advocates of using electronic voting and have talked to their neighbours, have even lent their voting machines to neighbouring countries to introduce them to using electronic voting. And I think we see this reflected in the take-up of electronic voting machines in Asia, in South America, where there are many countries which use them, and many more which are considering using them in the future as well. I think in terms of Europe and North America, European and North American countries are much more hesitant about using electronic voting machines, largely related to concerns about the security of the voting machines. And we've even seen some countries in Europe which have used electronic voting machines over several elections, over maybe 10 years in the case of the Netherlands, and then decided to stop using electronic voting machines completely, and are now doing entirely paper ballots. In terms of internet voting, there are 14 countries around the world which have used internet voting for their political elections. 2 of them use internet voting nationwide, Estonia and the United Arab Emirates, and in fact the UAE only uses internet voting, although it's based in polling stations. 5 more countries use internet voting in parts of their country or for parts of their electorate. And these are Mexico, Australia, Switzerland, France, and Canada. 2 countries have ongoing pilots. 3 countries have piloted and did not continue using internet voting. And 2 countries discontinued the use of internet voting after using it for at least one election. In terms of the benefits that countries have achieved through using electronic voting mechanisms, I think that one of the biggest ones, certainly from the Brazilian and Indian perspective, would be the elimination of invalid ballots. Electronic voting machines can be programmed to not allow invalid ballots to be cast. And in Brazil, largely because of high rates of illiteracy, invalid ballot rates were sometimes up to 40% before the introduction of e-voting, which is obviously a huge component of the electorate who are not able to properly record their choices. India also had very high levels of invalid ballots, and often the numbers of invalid ballots in a constituency were greater than the winning margin between the first and second candidates. So clearly, these could have had a huge impact on the reflection of the will of the voters. The speed and accuracy of results is another issue where electronic voting has had huge consequences, positive consequences. In Brazil, again, the vote counting process used to take several weeks. It was a period of great uncertainty and tension in the country, and we saw large number of vote tabulators being manipulated to affect the results of the elections. And the use of electronic voting has eliminated that problem from Brazilian elections. I think another serious concern about elections is the logistics of printing and distributing ballots, collecting them back in, and electronic voting machines can limit those logistic challenges, although they bring new logistic challenges as well in terms of storage and moving those machines around as well. I think EVMs also can deal with complex elections very, very effectively. So when you look at preference voting, the time it takes to count ballots, where there are several preferences expressed in a ballot, can be a long time. And we've seen electronic counting of ballots taking place in the UK with the mayoral elections. We saw electronic voting machines being trialled in Ireland, and I think that was in large part due to the length of time it takes to count the ballots in Ireland where they use a single transferable voting system. And I think the final main benefit I would identify is accessibility. Particularly with internet voting, it makes participation in the election a lot easier for overseas voters, for travelling voters, for remote voters, and also voters with disabilities. They can often participate much more effectively in the process by themselves using electronic voting mechanisms. So I think they would be the main benefits that we're seeing.
Tad, are those the same sorts of benefits that U.S. election administrators have cited for use of e-voting, and what have the trends been in the U.S.?
So in the U.S., the trend toward e-voting started with the 2000 election, and as most people remember, in Florida and in some other states, there were failures of paper ballots to be able to be tabulated correctly. So you had punch card ballots that were problematic, and you also had optical scan ballots where people were making mistakes, something that the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project refers to as residual votes. So these are votes that are either overvoted or undervoted, or people are skipping a race inadvertently. And so from that, you saw a move toward e-voting in polling places. So this is not remote e-voting, but this is e-voting in polling places where people are voting on a computer, and those votes are being then tabulated off of the computer. And one of the things that occurred in the U.S. is that there was also a push to have states do this because of the issue of disability accessibility, because the U.S. has very strong laws related to accessibility of various governmental activities like voting, and so they wanted to be able to make it where people who were blind or had other physical impairments could vote. The U.S. is also somewhat unique in that we have language minority laws, and so if you're a language minority, you have to be able to cast a ballot in your own language if you meet certain requirements. So under the Voting Rights Act, we have a requirement for that. So if you think about a very large jurisdiction like Los Angeles County, e-voting could be very beneficial to them because they can have all of their ballots on one machine in multiple languages. Although ironically, LA does not use e-voting. But one of the things that the other benefit is that we've seen, in jurisdictions that switch to either electronic voting machines or paper ballots that are then tabulated by electronic counting machines and that give people feedback, that you have a lowering of the number of overvotes and undervotes. And that's been the big movement. There's also been some small efforts to do internet voting projects, primarily geared toward people in the military. And those projects, what they're trying to do is to use the internet to facilitate voting from people overseas who have had difficulty voting in the past. So Okaloosa County, for instance, in 2008 did a very small project on this. There have been other projects that have been done in West Virginia and other states. The final thing I would point out too, and this builds on something that Ben was mentioning, is that in the US, one of the big pushes now is toward what is often referred to as electronic ballot transmission. So what I do is I transmit a ballot to you electronically, potentially let you vote that on a computer, and then you can print it out and send it back. And what that allows a voter to do is to have some of the benefits of absentee voting and the benefits of internet voting kind of melded together. So I can vote electronically, which makes it more difficult for me to make a mistake, and I can get feedback if I've made a mistake, but I can also be voting remotely and not have to go to a polling place on election day. The final point I would make too about the U.S. compared to other countries is we have very long ballots. For instance, in Utah in 2012, when I voted, there were about 35 races on my ballot. Those types of ballots pretty much require some sort of electronic process for either voting or for tabulation, because you just can't hand count that many ballots and that many races in a timely manner.
Yeah, and we saw that in Florida in the 2012 election too, because of long ballots in a couple of counties. You had many voters who had to wait hours, multiple hours to vote because of the long ballots. So we referenced at the beginning challenges in the U.S. So Thad, can you talk a little bit about that, specifically California in 2007 and other cases, other states? What are some of the challenges that have been brought in terms of e-voting that has really impacted the way electoral administrators have looked at e-voting?
Sure. I think that one of the biggest concerns that people have about e-voting is that it raises potential for ballot manipulation or for fraud. And in 2004, Michael Alvarez at Caltech and I wrote a book called Point, Click, and Vote about internet voting. And in that book, we discussed that in many ways, the problems of e-voting, or especially internet voting, are very similar to the problems that can exist in absentee voting. For instance, you can have all sorts of attempts to hack into the network, so I can try to intercept ballots, much like people can do with mail ballots. I can try to intercept them in the mail. You can have people being coerced to vote one way or the other. But there's also this additional concern that people have with e-voting, is that I can just hack into the system and try to manipulate the results. And we've had some policy changes since 2000 related to e-voting in polling places. So when I say e-voting, I'm referring to voting machines in polling places, and i-voting is more internet voting. And one of those big changes is that we now have what are called paper audit trails that come out that are with most of our electronic voting machines. So for instance, here in Utah, when I go vote with my son, at the end of the voting process, I get a screen that tells me if I've skipped any races or anything like that. But then before I can cast my vote, it prints out a record, and I can compare my electronic record to the paper record. So one of the things that people have tried to do is to promote the issue of ballot auditing, and to try to get people to take more seriously the idea of making sure that the electronic record and any sort of paper audit record match up. The other issue, though, and this is the broader issue, is that with internet voting, one of the two big problems are one is whether or not people can hack into the system, and two is the problem of identity. You know, we all have a physical identity. We have a driver's license or a government-issued identity card or something like that. But in most countries, Estonia being the one exception that I know of very well, most people don't have an internet identity. So it's very hard for me to know that Rakesh is Rakesh online. And so, you know, if you have an identity card that also has some sort of digital signature on it, that has a PIN where I can have a card and do those things, it does add a layer of security that you don't get otherwise. But most countries don't have that. And even in those systems, there are still questions about whether or not you can, you know, hack into the security of those systems. And there have been some, you know, high-level problems that have been identified with the way that code is written for voting machines and things like that, which has raised concerns. But I would note that, you know, a lot of the concerns that we've seen with internet voting have also played out with absentee voting. So, for instance, when the UK introduced absentee voting, and one of the first big elections they did afterwards, they had all sorts of questions arise about issues of fraud and things like that. And so, you know, these issues exist with any sort of remote system, be it a paper system or electronic.
Yeah, and also I think speaking of identity issues, that would be even more difficult in the U.S. given some constitutional and other concerns that we would have that might not exist in other countries.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Then, what about in the international context? Are there the same sorts of challenges, or are there different kinds of challenges that election administrators face when it comes to e-voting?
And I think security is a huge concern wherever electronic voting is being implemented, and especially so with internet voting. I think with voting machines, you have that possibility that I talked about, which is called the voter verified paper audit trail, where you can check on that piece of paper whether the vote has been recorded correctly or not. And I think the important thing to say about those sort of verification mechanisms is it's great to have that check. Many voters don't actually look, but what's very important is afterwards is that a certain number of machines, you go back and you count that paper record and you compare it against the electronic results, and they should be exactly the same. If they're not exactly the same, then clearly you have a problem with the voting machine. But it's important not just to have the verification mechanism, but to actually use it and to do audits, ideally random audits of a certain percentage of voting machines after the election, just to make sure that that's the case. And this is something that's been done in Venezuela recently with their voting machines. And apparently they've never found a mistake in the paper record and the electronic record. I definitely agree with Tad on this whole issue of electronic identity. It's I think you need to have very strong identification and authentication mechanisms for internet voting. Because otherwise, if it's just a voter ID and a password which is sent out in the post, I can easily give it to someone else, let them vote for me, sell my vote in that way. And obviously we don't want to try and develop electoral administration mechanisms which promote those sort of practices. So it's important, I think, that there is a strong electronic identity mechanism, and ideally something which is linked into other services. So if it's linked into tax returns, bank account details, other social services, then it's much more unlikely that you're willing to give those credentials away to someone else to use. And it makes, so I think it's a much stronger mechanism on which to base things like internet voting. The one thing I will say, I think the debate in the US is largely focused around the issue of security, particularly when it comes to internet voting. And it's definitely a very, very important issue to discuss. I think, though, that the debate in the US is defined by security. It's the one and only debate that seems to be going on in many ways about internet voting in the States. And I think that we've seen countries which have implemented internet voting recently, and which I think have taken those security concerns into consideration and have found ways of trying to mitigate them as much as possible. And I think I point to Norway as one good example where that's been the case. And I guess the other point I'd like to make is that sometimes paper voting is held up as the gold standard. It's perfect. Well, it's not perfect, and mistakes are made. We talked about invalid ballots being cast using paper votes. We talked about fraud and manipulation during the counting process in some of the countries around the world. So it's important to recognise that paper voting, the traditional way of casting ballots and counting ballots, is not perfect. It can be improved in many instances, but I think we should measure the possible use of electronic voting up against what is not a perfect system and not expect it to gold standard in many ways.
Okay, and what do you see in terms of future trends in terms of the use of e-voting, both internationally and in the US? And either one of you can respond.
Ben, do you want to go first? Why don't you take this? And then I'll talk about the US component.
Okay. Well, certainly in the work that I've been doing for IFES over the past 5 years or so, I've seen a lot of countries which are becoming increasingly interested in many election technologies, including things like biometric voter registration and identification of voters at polling stations. I think there is an interest in electronic voting. I think we will continue to see electronic voting grow around the world, but I think the big growth may well be in the use of internet voting, particularly to address those expatriate populations. There are many countries around the world which have large expatriate populations, and those populations find it very, very difficult to actually participate in the elections, even though they have a legal and often a constitutional right to do so. So you see countries like Pakistan, like Kenya, like South Sudan, where there's a strong interest in trying to enfranchise those expatriate populations, and there are many other countries which are in similar situations. Now they have challenges in doing that, and we talked about some of them in terms of security and in terms of authentication of voters online. But I think this is going to be a growth area in elections, trying to properly enfranchise the expatriates and the diaspora of these countries. I would see that as the biggest growth area in the future, I think.
And in the US context, I think that there are two things that are going on. One is, given the financial situation of most states and localities, you're not going to see a lot of changes in the types of voting systems people use because they're just expensive to invest in. But what you are going to see is the Department of Defense and the Federal Voting Assistance Program and states do projects to try to enfranchise our expatriate population and our military voters. So you're going to see activities focused on using very small internet voting demonstrations to try to enfranchise especially military voters. The other thing, though, that we're going to be seeing is the use of what we refer to as electronic ballot delivery, which I referred to a little bit earlier, which is the idea that if I'm an absentee voter or perhaps I'm blind or something like that, but I have a computer, I can have a ballot delivered to me. I can then vote that ballot electronically and then mail it back, or deliver it back some other way, including potentially, via, there are cases where people email ballots back or things like that, which are not the most secure things in the world to do, but they do occur. But I do think you're going to see a lot of electronic ballot delivery going on because it just gets ballots to voters faster. And that's going to become a big issue of controversy because it does raise a lot of the security concerns that we were referring to with internet voting generally, because processes that relate to any type of remote voting have certain types of security concerns.
Okay, we have a couple of...
Can I add to that? Because certainly in terms of remote voting and internet voting is one type of remote voting. I think there's a big issue that that has certainly been a debate in other countries, and that concerns the secrecy of the act of voting. And this is exactly the same as for postal voting. Obviously, when you're voting in a polling station, you're in a protected environment. You're meant to go behind the voting screen by yourself, and you cast your vote in privacy, and therefore no one really knows how you voted at the end of the day. As soon as you take the act of voting outside of the protected environment of the polling station, you could be doing it in a family situation. You could have someone who's coercing you to vote in a certain way. So this has been a big concern with internet voting. But I think there's been some interesting ways of trying to get around this challenge with internet voting. I guess Estonia started it really by their electronic voting system, allowing internet voters to cast a vote as many times as they wanted. But only the last one of their internet votes actually was counted and included in the result at the end of the day. So someone could be coerced to vote in a certain way when they were online, but then when they're free from that coercive environment, they can go and vote again later, and that vote which was not coerced would be the one that counted. But I think Norway took this even further and introduced a couple of things. The one was that there was an early voting period operates in Norway for a couple of months before the election. And basically and that's a paper voting period, and any paper ballot that was cast in that period would supersede any internet vote cast. And furthermore, the voters still had the option, after casting an internet ballot, to go to the polling station on election day and cast a paper ballot then. So what it means is that if any internet vote is coerced, if a voter is forced in a certain way, then the person who's doing the coercion doesn't know if that's the actual vote that will be counted. So it takes the incentive really to do that coercion out of the equation, because they'll never know for sure if they've had an impact on the actual vote cast.
So Ben, the Norway experience and the Estonia experience to some extent, does that seem to indicate that if you are to move to an internet voting system, that it has to, at least for the foreseeable future, in most countries, it has to be existing side by side with a paper or a polling station based voting system, just because of access issues and privacy issues?
I certainly think for voting in the country, I think that is the best way of doing it, yes. I think for some expatriate overseas voters, internet may be the only way that they can really participate in the process. I mean, Tad was talking about overseas voters in the States, particularly military voters, and they've really struggled to not only receive ballots on time, but then when they send them back in, to get them back into the States on time. It may be that for some of these populations, internet voting is the only real way of enfranchising them in the near future.
You know,
okay, we have
to add to that real quickly, I was going to say that you know, I do think that any type of internet voting will always be a supplement to traditional voting. You'll never see only internet voting. So even in Estonia, you do see a large percentage of people vote on the internet, but you also see a larger percentage vote in person, either early or on election day. And so it'll always be just one mode of many.
Okay, good. We have a number of comments, so let me just go through a few of them and get your responses. So Rob Weber from the blog Cyber the Vote asks, I find getting experts in the he says, in the US, the conversation about online voting is completely dominated by opponents. So Pat, this is for you. I find getting experts in the industry to speak up to be extremely difficult. Can you discuss why this may be the case? So I think getting to more of the political issue and the interest group issue related to e-voting.
Yeah, I think that what you see in the U.S. context is there is a dominance, in this debate by people who are more concerned about the security side, and there's less of a consideration given to the discussion of the benefits that come from it, like people casting ballots that are more complete or accessibility and things like that. And I do think that a lot of this, does have to do with something that happened in 2004, which was that there was a project to do internet voting through the Department of Defense for people in the military, and there was a report that came out that was done by 4 computer scientists who were very critical of internet voting, and I think that sort of set the tone of the debate. And I think you also have had some major news outlets focus on security concerns and focus much less on the enfranchisement issues that can exist. And I think that has been another aspect of this that's been problematic. But they're absolutely right. I mean, this debate is dominated largely by the computer science world and not by the people who are concerned more about accessibility. And
Rob also points to a comment that Ben made earlier, that it seems to Ben that the discussion in the U.S. is fixated on security issues and does not sort of focus on other issues as accessibility and other issues. So Rob asked why this may be the case. Why do you think this may be the case?
I don't know. I'm no expert on the political scene in the States or election administration. I don't know. I mean, these are serious concerns. We can't ignore security, so they're right to be raising them. But I think that as Tad says, there are other issues that should be entered into the debate about accessibility, about inclusion, about making sure that we eliminate invalid ballots. So these are also very important aspects to consider when we're looking at electronic and internet voting, and they really should have their time on the floor as well with these issues.
One of the political differences too, just to point out, and Ben I'm sure can echo on this, is that the U.S. is a very unique system of election administration. I mean, we have 10,000 local election jurisdictions operating in 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, and it's highly decentralized. We don't have a national election body that governs our elections. There's no centralized resource for doing research and things like that. So, for instance, in the UK, you have a very robust, election authority that does research. In the Estonian case, you have a pretty robust, they have a robust election system process as well, even for a very small country. And we don't have that same sort of thing. And I'm sure that affects both the research side of this, but also, aspects of the debate as well.
Okay. Go ahead, Ben.
I mean, example, because we do have an election commission, but it's only really involved in political finance, policy, trying to make policy on elections, and also it produces reports on the elections. It doesn't actually manage the electoral process in the UK. We again have a devolved system where the local councils manage it from a small department within each local council. But I think maybe the difference is there's a greater level of state legislation on elections than in the States. I think, particularly with respect to election administration, federalism plays a very strong role in the approach that's taken in the States, so that all of those decisions are taken down at a local level. Whereas there is a sort of overviewing structure which is defined at a central level in the UK, and there's relatively little scope for change in that structure down at a local level. So there is a lot defined nationally in the UK.
Okay, great. We have another question dealing specifically with the Argentine system. It's from Nicholas Dean. What opinion do you have on the Argentinian system? It is a machine that prints a ballot and stores the info in an RFID chip in the ballot and not in the machine. So the votes are stored in the ballot box, and at the end of the day are counted with the assistance of the machine, but with the control of authorities. Ben
Yeah, I mean, it's an unusual way of doing it, but Argentina are not the only country that have done this. Belgium used a similar system with a magnetic card which stores the vote value, and that's put into a ballot box, an electronic ballot box, which counts the card as it goes in, and so that ballot box also produces the results at the end of the day. But you can go back and you can recount the cards if you wanted to check the results. It's a perfectly legitimate way of doing it. It's a little bit unusual, but there's nothing wrong with it in principle. I think it can be designed in such a way that you get the kind of verification mechanisms that you need.
Ed, anything?
Really briefly, is I think that the big issue that exists with all voting systems, be they paper or electronic, is this issue of auditability. and having a system in place where you can audit the entire election. And one of the odd focuses that's occurred in the U.S. Is that we have this sort of fixation at the end of an election between comparing electronic results with the paper ballot results, but not considering the need to audit the election more broadly and think about, well, how do I audit the processes and procedures that got me those paper ballots in the first place, or the electronic ballots? And I think this issue of auditability is a very important one. My colleague Mike Alvarez and another colleague Lana Atkinson, we just edited a book called Confirming Elections, which looks at this issue, and it's a very important one to try to figure out, well, how do I go through the process of making sure that whatever ballots I'm interested in, be they paper or electronic, are the right ballots, and that I'm counting them correctly and I'm auditing them correctly to make sure that, and making sure that the election was run correctly, because there are a lot of ways to screw up an election other than miscounting a ballot. I can disenfranchise people in a lot of ways, or I can engage in a lot of activities that are going to cause problems. And I think that this issue of auditing is actually one of the best things that has come from the debate in the U.S. context, and that is spread internationally about electronic voting, is this issue of focusing on how do I audit an entire election.
Okay, thank you. Another comment from Vlad Pran, and I think this gets at the larger issue of what EMBs and election administrators should be, the issues they should be considering when they're looking at e-voting, whether it's e-voting with machines or i-voting. Vlad asks, to paraphrase, seems to me that most of the issues that you're raising are concerns that seem to be addressed in countries with serious infrastructure and resources. What about countries of Africa and Asia, which are still developing election administration and whose administration is still struggling to meet some basic standards? I guess the question comes down to, is e-voting appropriate everywhere? And what are some of the issues that administrators, election administrators, must address in order to sort of answer that question? The feasibility of e-voting, what types of e-voting, how far to implement it, issues like that. Ben or Thad?
Okay. I think it's an interesting question. I think it's really important when a country decides to think about using electronic voting that they consider the issue properly. And we've always recommended that countries do a very comprehensive feasibility study to look at all aspects of using electronic voting machines. But that really starts with, I guess, in many ways, defining what the problem is. What are the problems they're trying to address by any change in the election management system? And then defining the objectives for implementing electronic voting. I think these are very important first steps for any country thinking about using electronic voting technologies. And obviously, pilot projects are vitally important, and maybe several pilot projects over a period of time, and a proper assessment afterwards of what was successful, what was not successful about implementing the pilot projects. Throughout the whole process, I think it's vitally important that stakeholders are deeply involved at every step of the process, so their opinions, their concerns are taken into consideration and dealt with as much as possible. But I think essentially that Vlad was asking whether it's possible for some countries in their stage of development to implement electronic voting technologies. And I guess the gut response would be no. I mean, you need to reach a certain level of development before that's the case. But I think we see countries which maybe we wouldn't put in that category have moved towards implementing electronic voting and have done it very effectively. So I don't think we can really rule out any countries from implementing these technologies. It needs to be based on a country-by-country basis, with the merits of implementing in that particular country properly assessed.
Let me just add, one thing to that, which is that I do think that the point Ben made is absolutely correct, that you need to think about why you're doing this in the first place. And I don't think that these systems are necessarily much more problematic to implement. So, for instance, if you have a case where you have a large population that is rural, or you have a large population of people who are illiterate, or you have problems with the ballot box stuffing or things like that, there may be really good reasons to move to electronic voting. And in fact, you see in a lot of countries, in some countries, that have adopted electronic voting, they did so to address these exact problems, which was they needed to be able to transport ballots securely. And the electronic system allowed them to interface with people who had different language problems, so they could show people visual pictures of candidates or things like that. That they wanted to be able to slow the number, how many times a vote could be cast on any given machine per minute or per hour. So, for instance, in India, my understanding is that was one of the things that they did with their voting systems, is that they limited the number of ballots that could be cast in hour period, because people would just go into polling places and just stuff ballot boxes. And so this slowed that process. And in the Brazilian case, you see them moving to internet voting in part because they wanted to enfranchise people who lived way out in the middle of the Amazon. And so I think there are a lot of reasons why a country may want to do this. But I think that the question is a really good one, in the fact that no country or group should do either electronic or internet voting just because they want to, or just because they think it's a good idea. They need to have a good rationale for why they're doing it, and also have thought through how they're going to make it work for their country.
Okay. Great. I don't see any more questions online. Thad, do you or Ben have some final comments? Especially Thad, I think it'd be interesting actually I do have one final question. A lot of the challenges to e-voting in the U.S., especially machine voting, have prompted some legislative changes, some sort of administrative changes. Can you talk a little bit about that, what state authorities have been doing in response to some of those challenges? And then how do you see, I think everybody's looking at internet voting now, as how when that gets implemented, and there's already been some significant challenges to the viability or the security issues as far as internet voting is concerned. How do you see that playing out, let's say, by the 2016 election or so?
Sure. I think that, let me talk about it from now till 2020, because I think that there's an interesting kind of political point to make here. In the U.S., we basically are having, prior to 2008, we had two debates going on. One debate was about the security of electronic voting machines, and that debate was pushed primarily by Democratic Party representative secretaries of state. So, for instance, in Ohio and in California. And you had big pushes to do security reviews of electronic voting machines and things like that. And you had efforts on that side. On the other side, you had this debate about voter ID and voter fraud and things like that. Interestingly, what has happened since 2008 is that, not surprisingly, with the election of President Obama, Democratic secretaries of state were not very interested in suggesting that voting machines were problematic, because they don't want to suggest that their president got elected problematically, right? And you've had that side of the debate has kind of fallen off of the radar, and you have much more of this debate about voter ID and things like that. But I do think that in 2016, if the election results are different, you could have this debate pick back up again, where people are going to raise questions about electronic voting and things like that. We also haven't had any big problems with it. And interestingly enough, we may have there are problems being raised about absentee voting in the U.S. as it becomes more broad, and that may, change this debate entirely, where there actually may be pushes to do more internet voting, because it'll be seen as being more secure than paper ballot voting, or causing fewer residual votes and things like that. It'll be interesting to see how this debate proceeds after we have the 2016 election.
Okay, yeah, that would be interesting to see. Ben, any final comments?
I guess one final comment. Obviously the world is getting more and more connected in many different ways, with internet availability, with mobile devices which can connect to the internet, mobile phones. It seems inconceivable to me that in 50 years' time we'll still be voting in paper ballots at polling stations. I think inevitably we must be moving towards some sort of remote voting, whether it's on the internet or through mobile devices. So I think really it's important to recognize that trend and try and move towards it. And see, we're not there yet. I don't think in many ways the world is ready to move wholeheartedly towards internet voting, but I think inevitably we're going in that direction. So I think it's appropriate to try and start researching some of these issues and find out good solutions to them.
And I think that research question is kind of the key one over the next couple of years, is researching how do we do this, and also how do we address this identity problem, because I think that's a fundamental aspect of this whole debate is how do I authenticate that Ben is Ben and Rakesh is Rakesh and Thad is Thad when I'm using the internet.
Okay, actually, just as we were about to sign off, there's another question, I think specifically for Thad. With budget constraints at state and local levels, do you see a paradigm change in jurisdictions adopting different acquisition models? This is highly technical. For acquiring and delivering election services. Services that can be delivered on a variety of user devices with fees based on usage concept. Services that need to be hosted or managed by a jurisdiction. So basically the budget constraints, and how will that play a role in what happens in the future?
Sure. So to make the obvious caveat, there are 50 different states and 10,000 jurisdictions, so these are going to be handled differently in different places. But I do think that the budget problem is a very real one for states, and we're unlikely to see major investments made in new voting technologies. And this is a very weird business model too. It's very hard for companies to effectively enter this market because there just isn't a very clear business model for voting technology companies, and this has been a problem that's been identified since the 2000 election. And so I think that this is a very difficult question, but I don't think that you're going to see major changes in how states are doing things in the near term. Ben may have some ideas based on what has gone on internationally about other models and how they're used, but in the U.S. context, I don't think this is going to change very much.
Ben?
Yeah, I don't think I really have anything to add to it, add to the discussion just now.
Okay, great. Well, I think this has been a very interesting discussion, and hopefully the viewers watching online found this to be interesting as well. Ben, thank you, and Thad, thank you for taking part. And we thank the viewers for taking part as well. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.